We the people, forming a more perfect union, elect a president every 4 years to represent what we believe America should be. The early presidents were a reflection of the people during their times, no more, no less. Their views on race were often a reflection of America's views as well. From the beginning, the mood for slavery was changing. We saw this with the first president, George Washington. He held over 300 slaves throughout his lifetime, yet while president, increasing abolitionist sentiments caused him misgivings about slave ownership. His slaves were freed just over a year after his death, as stated in his will. It was his wife who was resistant to freeing them then. John Adams was an abolitionist. Quote, "I have, through my whole life, held the practice of slavery in such abhorrence that I have never owned a Negro or any other slave, though I have lived for many years in times when the practice was not disgraceful." End quote. When the best men in my vicinity thought it was not inconsistent with their character, and when it has cost me thousands of dollars of labor and subsistence of free men, which I might have saved by the purchase of Negroes at times when they were very cheap, we see that the second president of the United States supported the dignity of blacks in America. But oh, the beleaguered Thomas Jefferson! He was perhaps one of the most conflicted founding fathers on the topic of slavery. He wrote from Notes on Virginia, 1781, "There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people, produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passion, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal." Most historians believe Jefferson fathered multiple children with his slave, Sally Hemings, whom he cared for and perhaps loved, who was the half-sister of his late wife. Notwithstanding, Jefferson held the largest number of slaves than any other president, over 600. From Mr. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market which men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. James Madison, no confusion here. Madison proposed the 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and legislative representation. He did not free his slaves in his will. He owned over 100 slaves. James MONROE owned 75 slaves. Quote, "What was the origin of our slave population? The evil commerced when we were in our colonial state, but acts were passed by our colonial legislature prohibiting the importation of more slaves into the colony. These were rejected by the Crown." End quote. We declared our independence, and the prohibition of a further importation was among the first acts of state sovereignty. John Quincy Adams was clear. The inconsistency of the institution of domestic slavery with the principles of the Declaration of Independence was seen and lamented. No insincerity or hypocrisy can be fairly laid to their charge. Never from their lips was heard one syllable of attempt to justify the institution of slavery. They universally considered it as a reproach fastened upon them by the unnatural stepmother country, and they saw that before the principles of the Declaration of Independence, slavery, in common with every other mode of oppression, was destined sooner or later to be banished from the earth. Jackson owned almost 200 slaves. During his campaign for the presidency, he faced criticism for being a slave trader, but he did not free his slaves in his will. Interesting, in his address to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana, 1814, he called them to arms, to fight. Jackson appealed to their brotherhood as Americans. As sons of freedom, you are called upon to defend our most inestimable blessing. As Americans, your country looks with confidence to her adopted children for a valorous support, as a faithful return for the advantages enjoyed under her mild and equitable government. As fathers, husbands, and brothers, you are summoned to rally around the standard of the eagle, to defend all which is dear in existence. Martin Van Buren's father owned 6 slaves. The only slave he personally owned was Tom, who escaped in 1814. When Tom was found in Massachusetts, Van Buren tentatively agreed to sell him to the finder, but terms were not agreed, and Tom remained free. Later in life, Van Buren belonged to the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western Territories without actually advocating for abolition outright. William Harrison inherited several slaves. As the first governor of the Indiana Territory, he unsuccessfully lobbied Congress to legalize slavery there. John Tyler owned 70 slaves and never freed any of them. He consistently supported slavery and its expansion during his time in political office. James Polk became the Democratic nominee for president in 1844, partially because of his tolerance for slavery. He owned 25 slaves in contrast to Van Buren. He generally supported slavery as president, but his will provided for the freeing of his slaves after the death of his wife. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution ended up freeing them long before her death in 1891. Although Zachary Taylor owned around 150 slaves throughout his life, he generally resisted attempts to expand slavery into the territories. After his death, there were rumors that slavery advocates had poisoned him. Tests of his body over 100 years later have been inconclusive. Under Millard Fillmore's administration, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850 as part of a compromise between Southern slaveholders and Northern Free Soilers. It required that all escaped slaves upon capture be returned to their masters and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. Abolitionists nicknamed it the Bloodhound Law for the dogs that were used to track down runaway slaves. Franklin Pierce was vehemently against the abolitionist movement, despite being from New Hampshire, and saw it as fundamentally a threat to the unity of the nation. He alienated anti-slavery groups by championing and signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. Yet he failed to stem conflict between the North and South, setting the stage for Southern secession and the Civil War. Slavery in the states is beyond the reach of any human power except that of the respective states. This was the statement of James Buchanan. But be this as it may, it is the imperative and indispensable duty of the government of the United States to secure to every resident inhabitant the free and independent expression of his opinion by his vote. He was often called the Doughface, a Northerner with Southern sympathies. Abraham Lincoln, the president who freed the slaves. Many of Lincoln's public anti-slavery sentiments were presented in the 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates during his unsuccessful campaign for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Lincoln stated that, quote, Negroes had the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote, in his first debates. But in his speech in Columbus, Ohio on September 16, 1859, he stated that he was not advocating Negro suffrage. Lincoln often expressed moral opposition to slavery in public and private. He stood by the Republican Party's platform of 1860, stating that slavery should not be allowed to expand into any more U.S. territories. Lincoln believed it prudent to administer a slow death to slavery through gradual emancipation and voluntary colonization rather than to follow the abolitionists and demanding an immediate end to slavery without compensation to owners. In 1863, Lincoln ordered the freedom of all slaves in the area's states in rebellion. As president, Lincoln was first concerned with saving the Union. Quote, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union can be the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." End quote. There you have it. The first Johnson to replace an assassinated president was Andrew Johnson. The first took rights away from blacks. The second signed affirmative action and voting rights into law. Both were Southern born. While vice president to Abraham Lincoln, Johnson owned a few slaves and was supportive of James Polk's slavery policies. As military governor of Tennessee, he convinced Lincoln to exempt the state from the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves there. As president, Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment and vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting equal protection to all citizens, as he doubted it was sound policy to make our entire colored population U.S. citizens. Johnson also issued pardons to wealthy Confederate traders and gave his blessings to the Southern states to issue the Black Codes, reinstituting slavery by another name. Ulysses Grant, although he served as a general in the Union Army, his wife Julia has control of 4 slaves during the war, given to her by her father. All would be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 that pertained to states in rebellion. She chose to free them then, at that time, even though the proclamation did not apply to Missouri. Grant is known to have personally owned one slave, William Jones, from 1857 to 1859. O. Rutherford Hayes, the by any means necessary president. Hayes was a lawyer and staunch abolitionist who defended refugee slaves in court proceedings in the antebellum years. During the Civil War, he was seriously wounded fighting in the Union Army. However, in a contested presidential election, Hayes agreed to the terms of the notorious Compromise of 1877. In exchange for 1 vote needed from Democrats to assume the presidency, Hayes would have to withdraw military troops from the South, end Army support for Republican state governments there, and end efforts of African American freedmen to establish rights, count on government enforcement of laws, safety from hate groups, and therefore cast them back into slavery at the mercy of whites. In effect, officially end the Reconstruction era. James Garfield's political agenda was formulated from his fervent support of civil rights and fierce opposition to government corruption. In support of civil rights, Garfield appointed former slaves to government positions and recommended a universal education system funded by the federal government that would be free to all Americans. Garfield made significant proposals for civil rights reforms that were later signed into law. This is refreshing. As a young New York attorney, Chester Arthur defended slaves who arrived in New York, making them automatically free. In an 1854 civil rights case, Arthur was the lead attorney representing Elizabeth Graham after she was denied a seat on a streetcar because she was black. He won the case, and the verdict led to desegregation of New York City streetcar lines. As president, Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which resulted in denying citizenship to immigrants until 1898, the first total ban on a nation or ethnic group from immigrating to the country. He may have had the ear of national black leaders at this time who opposed hiring immigrants rather than black Americans who they felt were more entitled to domestic jobs. On the issue of race, Grover Cleveland from New York agreed with white Southerners in their reluctance to treat African Americans as social and political equals. He made special efforts to reach out to Democrats and former Confederates in the South to assure them that they had a friend in the White House. He also opposed integrated schools in New York and saw African Americans as essentially inferior. In believing that government should not interfere with what he regarded as a social problem, he opposed efforts to protect suffrage for African Americans. However, Booker T. Washington had his ear and advised him on occasion. It was on the request of Washington that Cleveland authorized last-minute, desperately needed funds for the Negro exhibition in Paris, France in 1900, headed by W.E.B. Du Bois, that displayed to the world the outstanding achievements of blacks 35 years after slavery. Benjamin Harrison said, quote, "The colored people did not intrude themselves upon us. They were brought here in chains and held in communities where they are now chiefly bound by a cruel slave code. When and under what conditions is the black man to have a free ballot? When is he, in fact, to have those full civil rights which have so long been his in law? When is that quality of influence, which our form of government was intended to secure, to the electors to be restored?" In many parts of our country where the colored population is large, the people of that race are by various devices deprived of any effective exercise of their political rights and of many of their civil rights. The wrong does not expend itself upon those whom votes are suppressed. Every constituency in the Union is wronged. William McKinley was unwilling to alienate the white South. He did little to address the growing disenfranchisement and exclusion of black Americans from political power. McKinley denounced lynching in his 1897 inaugural address, but failed to condemn the practice formally. He also refrained from taking action to curtail the general anti-black violence in the South that had reached near epidemic proportions in the last 4 years of the century. Instead, McKinley's initiatives in race relations were largely cosmetic. He appointed 30 African Americans to positions of consequence, which were principally in diplomatic and records offices, but that number fell far short of what black Republicans had wanted from the party. During the Spanish-American War, he even countermanded orders, preventing the recruitment and service of black soldiers. Theodore Roosevelt made small strides in U.S. race relations and was not considered a leader of the civil rights movement. He spoke out publicly against race-based discrimination. Roosevelt appointed several African Americans to federal offices, but they were lower-level positions. In fact, he was opposed to school segregation and ordered an end to it in New York while serving as governor of the state. Roosevelt was noted as the first president to invite a black American to the White House as a distinguished guest. He invited Booker T. Washington, a prominent African American leader in his time, to dinner at the White House in 1901. Washington shared his views on racism and politics during the meeting. William Taft, from the beginning, stated that he would not appoint African Americans to federal jobs. Termed Taft's Southern policy, black appointments invited white protests. Taft removed most black office holders in the South and made few appointments of them in the North. Feeling betrayed by the party of Lincoln, under Taft, Negroes both North and South began to drift toward the Democratic Party. Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner to be elected president since Zachary Taylor in 1848, and his ascension to the presidency was celebrated by Southern segregationists. Several historians have spotlighted consistent examples in the public record of Wilson's overtly racist policies and political appointments, such as segregationists he placed in his cabinet. Wilson continued to appoint African Americans to positions that had traditionally been filled by blacks, overcoming opposition from many Southern senators. However, the Wilson administration escalated the discriminatory hiring policies and segregation of government offices that had begun under President Theodore Roosevelt and had continued under President Taft. Although Warren Harding's first address to Congress called for passage of anti-lynching legislation, he initially seemed inclined to do little for African Americans. He did ask cabinet officers to find places for blacks in their departments. On October 26, 1921, Harding gave a speech in Birmingham, Alabama, to an integrated audience. Harding stated that the social and racial differences between whites and blacks could not be bridged, but urged equal political rights for the African American. Harding stated he did not mind seeing black Republicans' support end if the result was a strong two-party system in the South. He would see literacy tests for voting continue if applied fairly to white and black. Whether you like it or not, Harding told his integrated audience, unless our democracy is a lie, you must stand for that equality. The white section of the audience listened in silence, while the black section cheered. Calvin Coolidge may have been devoid of racial prejudice, but rarely took the lead on civil rights. He spoke in favor of the civil rights of African Americans, saying in his first State of the Union address that their rights were just as sacred as those of any other citizen under the U.S. Constitution, and that it was a public and private duty to protect those rights. Coolidge repeatedly called for laws to make lynching a federal crime. Herbert Hoover seldom mentioned civil rights while he was president. He believed that African Americans and other races could improve themselves with education and individual initiative. He appointed more African Americans to federal positions than Harding and Coolidge combined, but was unwilling to push for a federal anti-lynching law. In June 1941, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which created the Fair Employment Practice Committee. It was the most important federal move in support of the rights of African Americans between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Roosevelt was viewed as a hero by African Americans who saw vast improvements throughout the New Deal era in literacy, job training, and work in response to the Great Depression. He was influenced by one of the greatest race advocates of the time, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. In February 1948, Harry Truman submitted a civil rights agenda to Congress that proposed creating several federal offices devoted to issues such as voting rights and fair employment practices. Quote, "My forebears were Confederates, but my very stomach turned over when I learned that Negro soldiers, just back from overseas, were being dumped out of Army trucks in Mississippi and beaten." End quote. Executive Order 9981, 1948, required equal opportunity in the armed forces. Executive Order 9980, 1948, made it illegal to discriminate against persons applying for civil service positions based on race. A third, in 1951, established the Committee on Government Contract Compliance. This committee ensured defense contractors did not discriminate because of race. Dwight Eisenhower made clear in his first State of the Union address in 1953, quote, "I propose to use whatever authority exists in the office of the President to end segregation in the District of Columbia, in the federal government, and any segregation in the armed forces," end quote. When he encountered opposition from the services, he used government control of military spending to force the change through, stating, quote, "Wherever federal funds are expended, I do not see how any American can justify a discrimination in the expenditure of those funds," end quote. So, who is your president? No perfect president then or now, but we the people elect the president.